Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Today we're talking about The Bikeriders. This period piece, released last year and currently available on Prime, starred Austin Butler, Jodie Comer, and Tom Hardy. But despite its excellent pedigree, it garnered only a ripple of awards contention. Nonetheless, I really enjoyed the film, and I'm really excited about today's conversation because my guests are from the AD team. First up, Pete Dress. You were the key second assistant director. We've been friends since my time in LA, and I'm glad to finally get you on the show. Welcome to Below the Line.
Thanks, Skid. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here, Pete. I also owe you thanks because you've brought along Don Sparks, who was the first assistant director and a producer on The Bikeriders. Don, glad you could join us.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Excited to have this opportunity.
I think this is going to be a fun film to talk about. Warning for listeners, today's conversation will contain spoilers. Go watch the film, come back and join us. Now, right out of the gate, I want to give a shout out to writer and director Jeff Nichols. His 2016 film, Midnight Special, is one of my favorite under-recognized films of all time. Folks haven't seen it, you should check it out. Talk to me, Don, about how you came on board and what it was like working with Jeff.
I actually had been contacted several years ago by one of the other producers on the project, and I wasn't available at the time. And then this time, when she contacted me, it just so happened that one of the other projects I was going to do fell through. And it was really funny because that project fell through on a Friday, and Monday morning I got a call from her saying, "I hear you're available now." And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely. I have no idea how you found this out so suddenly," but I was happy to hear from her. And when she told me it was Jeff Nichols, I instantly went into his filmography. I knew some of his work. I've always been a fan of what he's done. I was most familiar with Mud and with Loving, but then I went back to his first film, which was Shotgun Stories, which absolutely blew me away. So that's, long story short, that's how I ended up being invited back to the party.
When you get invited to work with a director you haven't worked with before, do you typically go back and watch their old work?
Yeah, absolutely. It gives you an idea of their style, the type of stories they like to tell. Jeff's filmography is pretty specific to very American stories, grounded in the Midwest. The more I can find out about the work that the director has done, their point of view, it gives me, one, the opportunity to have intelligent conversation with them, during the in process, and two, to kind of ground myself in the work that this person's done. I don't want to walk into, a situation where I'm completely unfamiliar with the director's work. So yeah, if I have the opportunity to, I will absolutely go into the director's filmography and see some of their previous work.
Now, Pete, when did you get involved? You and Don have worked together before.
We have, and it was right after Don got that call that he called me and asked if I would be okay going out of town on a Jeff Nichols movie. And I was pretty much, yeah, that's kind of an absolute yes. And to circle back about watching their previous work, Jeff's very loyal. So his DP, Adam Stone, and his production designer, Chad Keith, have been with him since film school. I think they all went to North Carolina School of the Arts together. So it allows you to sort of see what they've been up to before you join the party. I did the same thing. The only one of his that I had not seen prior was Shotgun Stories, and that was a hard find. I think I got it on eBay. It's a really hard one to find. It's not streaming, at least when I looked for it. So it just allows you to catch up. He's like your contemporary Southern fiction guy. It allows you to kind of see where his head is and what he's done, and allows you to kind of get into the process.
And you talked about going out of town. So where did this filming take place?
We were in and around Cincinnati, Ohio, pretty much. We touched into northern Kentucky just a little bit, not very much. The majority of the work was, on the outskirts of Ohio. We were looking for a location that looked like the Rust Belt. The story was originally set in Chicago, but obviously, if you were to film in Chicago today, you wouldn't be able to find those sort of Rust Belt locations. Whereas, in some of these smaller towns outside of Cincinnati that haven't found their way back to prosperity yet. You have a lot of these old locations that look very much like the Rust Belt from the 60s.
Yeah, both my parents are from Cincinnati. I actually know that area pretty well. That's did you get into Loveland? That's where my grandpa had a place. I'll have to watch it again with see if I recognize anything.
I do recall seeing signs for Loveland, whether we drove through it or we're
uh,
adjacent to it. That I do recall seeing that area.
how long was filming? How long are you guys in Ohio?
Shooting schedule was 41 days, so roughly 8 weeks of filming. And I believe we probably prepped right along that same amount of time, 8 to 10 weeks. Pete, I'm not certain. When did you come in? 6 weeks out, 7 weeks out?
I think it was 6 or 7. Yeah.
There was just a lot to do in pre-production. So on a picture this size and with this budget, obviously everything is scaled down to the bare minimum so you can afford to make the picture. So it was a very intense prep for the amount of time that we had to actually prep for the picture.
When you're talking about prepping for the picture, as I mentioned at the top, you're the first assistant director and you're also credited as a producer. Are there additional responsibilities that come with that? Or is that just tell me what it means to have both those titles on a movie like this?
Well, it's kind of a two-pronged thing. One, it's a nod to the level of experience and expertise that I bring to the picture. I've been working as a first AD, over 15, close to 20 years. And it also, on the other side, it gives me a little bit more insight to the budgeting of the picture, which gives me a lot more latitude when I'm working on the schedule, planning the picture, knowing, where the bodies are buried, so to speak, where there are limitations, and being able to figure out a way to, maximize our production dollar and make the motion picture. Being a co-producer on the picture helps me get a little more of a peek behind the scenes.
Now, I want to dive right into what I can imagine was one of the biggest challenges of this film, and that is it is about motorcycles. You have a lot of motorcycles. It's a period piece, cast, background. Just give me a sense of how much of a challenge that was. And again, I'm sure that planning for that started right away in prep.
Absolutely. And I'm going to let Pete take that one because he did so much. Pete did so much of the heavy lifting. As I was planning the schedule and dealing with everything else, Pete was the guy that rode herd on getting these guys through their classes, their licenses. So Pete, go ahead.
Unintended road. It all started because Jeff wrote and directed, and he knew exactly what he wanted. He sort of had the template. These are the guys that I want riding, and these are the guys that will never ride. Like Michael Shannon, his muse was in the movie. Zipco, he never rode, but he had a picture bike. It was just in evidence at their events, at the bar, at the club meetups, whatever. Cockroach had a motorcycle, didn't ride. So Jeff knew in his mind what he wanted. And some of that was built around the fact that some of these guys already rode. Tom Hardy rode, Austin rode, Bo rode, Boyd Holbrook rode. So then it becomes a matter of, okay, we're going to have these guys on bikes without helmets and goggles. So that was a whole other conversation that the producers had with the underwriter to make sure they would even bless that. And what came back was they had to be licensed, even if we were on a closed, secured road with police. Like normally, if you have a car driving scene and you have somebody from the UK or New York, you're like, hey, just get in this car for 5 minutes and you can cheat it. And they don't have a license. We've all done that. But in this case, they had to be licensed regardless of the lockup. So that was we had to figure out who had a license. And then we had to figure out, per Jeff, obviously Tom Hardy, Johnny was going to be in front of the pack because he's the motorcycle club leader. So then we started positioning who was where in the group rides. And Don had this cool chart on the wall in the AD office that it was a cheat sheet: who rode, who didn't ride, and we just had to conform around Jeff's wishes. He just translated those into these little, I don't know if it was push pins or post-its. It was something on the wall that you could easily look at. And then you knew in a minute who was going to ride. So after we figured out what Jeff wanted, Then it was a matter of how big is the pack, because there are certain limitations to being able to shoot and get anything that's going to drive the story. You could have a pack of 50 bikes with the ones at the very back being non-period. You could cheat, or you could scale that down and they're all period, and you could get the same story told with less outlay of money or, lessons. Or so we just sort of drilling down, who was going to ride, where they were in the pack. And then after we settled in with the heroes, I think we had 6 actors, if I remember correctly, riding. And then around them were stunt players. And at the very back, we had motorcycle enthusiasts that had their own period bikes, which is cool because so many people were influenced by this book. They were more than happy to come with their period appropriate motorcycles. So the very back of the pack was our, what we call the OG, the core OG Vandals. And they were with us every time we did a group ride. And that rounded it out. I think at the peak that was manageable, whether it was the when they crashed the motorcycle show or when we're on the bridge, our peak core group was about 16 motorcycles. And then we only expanded that at the very last ride when the kid, spoiler alert, has taken over the club. We expanded the back of that pack, and I think we were over 30 for that final ride. That was the biggest ride we had ever done. So when we were in prep, just to get us to that level, we set up a motorcycle boot camp in a parking lot with cones like you would do for the DMV. So then I was trying to satisfy both worlds, having period appropriate bikes, but not disqualifying somebody out of the gate because their handlebar wasn't 100% where it should be for the period. So I had to kind of play devil's advocate with the picture bike coordinator and Jeff's instructions to make it all make sense. We're not going to put in a modern motorcycle, but at the same time, after the first day of riding lessons, I had one of my staff assistants down there. And when I got the report back that nobody passed, I'm like, that's not a thing because all these guys rode to work on their bikes. So I need more details. And then I found out it was because maybe their tire wasn't appropriate or their wheel and I was like, okay, everybody that didn't pass yesterday will come back and I want every one of these riders videotaped. So at the end of the day, I could watch their performance and then we would then arm wrestle about the bike.
And I think that's part of the reason we also ended up in Ohio because they do not have helmet laws there. Whereas if we'd gone to other states, we probably would not have been able to ride without helmets. We may have had to manufacture those soft helmets that have wigs on them that, they use sometimes for stunt sequences. But being true to the period and pure to the art of it, being in Ohio allowed us to have our riders ride without helmets.
And presumably it was successful. You didn't have any accidents, or if you did, they were.
I think we had one minor accident. I don't know that I would actually even call it an accident. There was no damage to the bike. There was no damage to the rider. It involved a pile of wet leaves, didn't stop exactly where we wanted it to, but everybody was okay. And again, considering the amount of riding that we did with the number of riders that we had, I think we were extremely fortunate that that was the only incident we had on the picture.
Well, and particularly when you're working on what I presume is a modest budget, to give this sort of attention into the safety and just to not cut those corners, I think it speaks a lot to the work you guys did.
Yeah, there were a lot of different writing discussions. And, there were ways that we could have cheated, but I think it would have hurt the motion picture because you would have been taken out of it. You would see, oh, he's on some sort of a device. He's not really riding. If you look at the scenes, you see these guys fully riding. You see their tires in contact with the ground. Maybe for some of the sequences, depending on a wide shot or not, we may have used a stunt double. But for the majority of the time, it was the real guys riding.
The other component to this too is Jeff, because he is the director and the writer, he's very malleable with things as they unfolded. Like the intro to the motorcycle club, it's Jodie as us. She's intro, they put her on the back of the bike. And when they crest that bridge, that is the Vandals. And Jeff had this shot in his head. And originally we were going to have all the other heroes in the club. And it was going to be like, Benny and Kathy on his bike. And then on the side, you'd see Johnny, you'd see Wahoo, you'd see Corky. But as we got into it further, Jeff realized that he just needed to be in the moment with Kathy and Benny, and he cut all that out. So not only did it reduce the shooting time because we were on that bridge for a specified amount of closure, but it also reduced the number of bikes on the bridge, which allowed him to actually, because Don and I got in the car and we mapped it out. I'm like, dude, this is just under 2 miles. That's not even the bridge. That's the beginning of the closure to the end of the closure. I'm like, how in the world are we going to get like 28 bikes in a 2 mile run and make it make sense? How do we turn those around to do take two? So Jeff was always, he was always with production management, if you will, and the creative side. And he's like, I'm not going to bring all the other guys in. They'll get a night off. They'll be happy. I need Benny, Kathy, the stunt guys, and the background. And that right there dropped the percentage of the bikes by about, 30% that we would need for that massive shot that he had in his mind.
Pete, what you mentioned earlier about that some of these guys actually never rode the bikes. I didn't realize it watching the movie. Like that's like it is creating the mood, and you just get a sense of them. That the idea that there were cheats there, it never came across. Very, very impressive, quite frankly. I wouldn't have guessed.
And the boot camp was all about that. Just because they were licensed doesn't mean they had ever ridden a 19. So the majority of my time was spent making sure because they want to, they want to drift off. They want to do their own thing. And I was like, no, we've got to do this. And we've got to do it. And we've got to do, you're sort of like the mother hen. We've got to do this and do this and do this and do this and do this, because it's going to be very important when we pack ride that you've been on this bike so much that because they're coming off modern bikes with their licenses. They don't ride these typically. Maybe some of them bought their bikes in the movie wrapped, but up until that point, I always felt like the evil stepmom. I'm like, nope, we got to go. Nope. And they're like, well, the parking lot's full of cracks. I'm like, I'll find a new parking lot. don't you worry about that. So.
Well, and that was another interesting part of the casting. In addition to casting the actors, Jeff was very specific about picking which bike each character rode, as opposed to just giving them a bike and saying, this is your bike, this is your bike. He probably spent a good half day matching bikes to characters.
Yeah, we had a deck of bike deck, and the deck, he would constantly thumb through it to make sure that it matched what he had in his mind for each of these guys. That's a good point, Don. That was probably a solid week of prep, just with the bike deck, changing it around, going to the warehouse where they were all stored so he could see the deck and the bike, and then imagining it in his mind, oh, this is Corky or Wahoo or Johnny. So yeah, that was another big component, is who rode what.
With some of the hero bikes, did you need multiples? I mean, I know that that's typical with cars and such, but how do you even do that with a situation like this?
Yeah, I think we had multiples on a couple of the bikes. I think we had multiples on Johnny's bike and on Austin's bike. The other ones were one-offs. As Pete mentioned earlier, our picture car coordinator, motorcycle coordinator, was very specific about, oh, this bike, is from this period, and so it wouldn't go here. And these guys are going to notice, like, not everybody's going to notice that this bike doesn't have the period correct shifter. But it was a very big part of, our planning, because the bikes that got rode the most, we definitely needed to have doubles on.
You also mentioned earlier that scene at night with the bridge where Kathy is riding with Benny. So with Kathy on the bike there, and I think there's another scene where the photographer, Danny, he's also doubled up on one of the group rides. Were those guys also part of the boot camp? It would make me uneasy if I was your insurance company.
And that's correct. They went 2 up during the boot camps. And we also imagined initially that there would be other Vandals' girlfriends on bikes. We ended up just using Danny Lyon, Mike Feist, and we used who they were calling Big Barb, who's actually quite small. They were the ones that ended up 2-upping in the group rides. But initially, we imagined that there would be other Vandals' girlfriends. So in order to accommodate that, we went out looking for women that rode so that they would know how to, quote unquote, behave in a 2-up situation. They wouldn't be squirming or whatever. So we had identified 4 or 5 other girlfriends. They just never made the final rides. It ended up just being Big Barb and our Dandelion, who were two upping. And those were two ups. They weren't, we didn't employ any cheats. Those are actually, they're with stunt players, but there was no cheats on those two bikes.
Yeah, and anything like that we knew we wanted to do, we always practiced that ahead of time to make sure everybody was comfortable. It wasn't something we did on the day and just said, "Hey, jump on the back of this bike, you're going to go for a ride," you know.
And roll cam,
We're
look like you're having fun. Don't look scared.
yeah. It's like, no, we all of the motorcycle riding had to be planned out so specifically that we had to do everything we could to limit the amount of risk that we were putting the riders in.
And so I am surprised that there weren't more cheats, or maybe if there's just very small cheats that we just haven't talked about yet. Because I'm reminded of like when I worked on Seabiscuit, we had this whole rig to fake a horse. Now, again, would something like that have been helpful on this, or all the prep work you did made that not necessary?
We looked at doing something like that, but with motorcycles, if you're on a trailer, there is space that's required around the trailer. So you can't necessarily get the motorcycles in the formation that you want them to. You would need to have two other bikes on the trailer, and then the trailer is going to be higher. So then the other bikes behind are going to look a little odd, because they're not at the same height. We did have one sheet that we used, spoiler alert, for when Benny and Kathy rode together. We used a Can-Am, which is a trike, two wheels in front and one wheel in the back. And that allowed us not only to ride very safely on this more stable platform, it also allowed us to put camera mounts on the bike. Even though most of the shots in that sequence were car to car or bike to car, we had a motorcycle camera platform for riding in the group with them. We were able to do some specific mount shots with the Can-Am.
Just as a testament, there was not a moment during that film that I thought, hey, maybe they're doing a cheat here, other than thinking like, oh my God, I hope everybody's safe. But it all looks great. Now, all the challenge we talked about would be true just for a modern set, but now you have the complication of it being a period film. The whole thing's set from 65 to 75. Bikes, cars, wardrobe, locations. Talking about the challenges of a period piece.
Well, with the bikes, it was the fact that they were so old. They didn't have the modern technology on them. You didn't have the electric starter. You actually had to crank them. I remember specifically Funny Sonny's motorcycle for the scene in front of the movie theater when he's out there. It took at least 100 cranks to get that thing started. and we were determined to get that shot. It was a very small shot in the movie. We actually took a splinter unit over there to get it. We were shooting it before we went to our night work, and this motorcycle just refused to start. It spilled oil all over the sidewalk. It was an absolute mess, but we finally got it started and were able to get the shot.
It makes it tricky because there's a specific break point in the story that Jeff had in his mind when the composition of the club begins to change. Guys are coming back from Vietnam, they're disenfranchised. So it's when they're in the roadhouse, if you will, when they're in that clubhouse and Kathy almost gets sexually assaulted. Spoiler alert, that was the demarcation in the script. So up until that point, we had what we called OG vandals. They were the guys, the greasers that had that look in the earlier days of the club. But we also had two groups of those. We had the OG vandals that rode, and then we had the OG vandals that were in evidence in the clubhouse or in various other places when they were doing their meetups. So after we get to that point in the story when the look starts to changing, then we had to find a whole new group of people. But don't forget, ideally, they have their own motorcycles. So our wall was littered with OG Vandals, OG Vandals that ride, OG Vandal girlfriends that can be on the back two up, new Vandals, new Vandals that ride. We had just a massive undertaking of trying to get this whole world building accomplished so that we could just move along in production. Because as we all know, we don't shoot in order, but we would have to have all these riders booked in prep so that I knew when to bring them in as we pushed forward and knew when to bring these certain vandals. So that made it tricky. And then sort of like the bane of everyone's period movie existence was the cars. We were a lower budget film, and Don and I and Molly, who was our other AD, we all see these cars and we know that it's the same 32 cars over and over and over and over. So that was always a constant struggle to shuffle the deck. So it didn't look like, a student film. And you're also in Ohio, where it's easy to say, oh, everyone's got a classic car up here, but it's a whole different thing when you want them to bring it to shoot for an entire day. It isn't that simple. So we got a lot of them out of Atlanta from proper picture car companies. And I think we had some help for the car show because that was a couple day thing. We were able to get some help from the community for that because we needed so many of them, to populate that world. So there's always, and then it's the same old thing. We don't want any non-period people peaking because you're in a city that doesn't have as much production in it, just the usual circumstances. The period movie is always the X factor in everything, more time, more money, more prep.
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest challenges for the costume department was actually coming up with the name and the logo for our bike club. We didn't want to, cross any boundaries. We wanted to make sure that we were clear of any other clubs that might have been in that area. I know the clubs tend to be very territorial. So coming up with a logo that didn't infringe on anybody's copyright or any other, motorcycle clubs that would have been in the area in order to again create a safe environment for us was something that was a challenge.
Yeah, we had some people show up in our original boot camps early on that were inked with local clubs, and the extras casting coordinators were the ones that would tip me off that maybe we shouldn't be bringing these guys in, just to be clear that we're not, we didn't want any other things to occur as a result of having somebody in a club that was inked appropriately to come ride with us. So I think we flagged probably 3 or 4 guys, and then we just came up with a reason why we didn't book them. It wasn't because they were already with a club. We just came up with a reason. So there was that whole other component to it too. We just wanted to keep everything level, if you will.
You find yourself in an interesting spot because you don't want to reject for the club, but you want to bring in for the club. And so I presume all that's planned out in advance as well. Like you guys are figuring this is how we're going to approach this, because there are pitfalls in here that in less deft hands, it'd be very easy to make a mistake.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Even if you look at the detail on the all of our characters' patches, we were careful not to go with any patch that, signified another motorcycle club or any other sort of most of them were in the style of the patches, but they were generic so that they looked right, but at the same time, they weren't offensive on a certain level, and they didn't create any other level of conflict that could have arisen should another motorcycle club see our riders riding in a pack.
Something else that I was impressed by on my second viewing is that there are a lot of characters in this. Like you were naming them, Pete, and which one's on bikes and which one's off, but they never look generic to me. Like it's very clear all through, and never costumey either, where you could feel like each of them had really grown into these clothes and they had come up with them. That was, again, a really massive undertaking with this much cast and background.
And I think the book helped inform a lot of that too, because some of those vignettes that we did were just mirror images of photos in the book. Jeff had a baseline of what, Cal looked like, or Cockroach, or any of these other guys, because they're loosely already in existence. So it was easy to model what we were up to because there was already something out in the world that documented this club. So I think that kind of helped with, keeping it sort of grounded and real, is because Jeff was always fascinated with this book and he wanted to put onto the screen what he felt when he first saw these photos.
Now, Don, earlier you mentioned the scene with Funny Sonny, and it reminded me that's Norman Reedus, who also has some bike riding experience. In fact, I think he's had a couple of documentary series where he just rides around. Now, the people that had experience and the people that didn't have any experience, did it become hierarchical among the cast? Like who had more time on the bike or who was Maybe I just learned it for the film.
No, not at all. The guys were all, very accommodating with one another. We were in the middle of, you know, Cincinnati, so there wasn't much to do. So they all kind of did things together. We actually went one night. We had rented out a go-kart racing track, and everybody raced go-karts all night. When you work on movies like that, it's always nice to see the camaraderie that happens. The guys were all very helpful with us. They always showed up on time. There would be, times when at the last moment Jeff would go, "Oh, I forgot I wanted to add such and such so and so to this scene." It's like, "Oh no." And Pete would have to like, "Hey, I'm sorry. I know you are in Kentucky on the bourbon tour, but can
It's
you be here
exactly
in
what
a
it
couple
was.
hours?"
Yeah, we won't name the specific cast member, but I was like, this just in, and that's what he was on a bourbon tour, and I was like, oh brother, we'll get you out. We'll get you out as fast as we can.
Yeah,
But
he got in his car and he made it to set and he made it to the in the scene.
yeah, but I think a lot of that has to do with Jeff too, because he's a filmmaker, and there's a certain love of film that just radiates off him, and it's easy to get in line with that when you have such a an energetic. How would you describe it, Don? He's just
Well, he's such a great collaborator. It was my first time working with him. And, I remember he had written some new dialogue for a scene and he came in and he put it on my desk and he asked me what I thought of it. And I was really taken that this is the first time that I worked with him and he's asking me to critique his work. And we sat there and we discussed the scene, for an hour or so. And I think that's what Jeff really brings to the table. He collaborates well with the cast. He collaborates well with Stone, his DP, with his production designer, costume designer. And when you work on an independently funded picture, that's the kind of spirit and camaraderie you have to have because you don't have money to waste. You don't have time to burn. Everybody literally has to be on the same page, pulling, the rope in the same direction to help us get across the finish line. So Jeff being so giving and such a good collaborator creates the environment where everybody gets on board and everybody wants to do their best work.
Other favorite scenes you want to put a spotlight on, either particular challenges or things that you just thought went really well?
I like the scenes when Kathy is confronting Johnny, where she's telling him that he can't have Benny. Those are great, and I really like the scene when Johnny kind of knows what's going to happen and he goes to visit her for that last time. That's a great scene too, before he goes and meets the kid.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the scene that I was going to spotlight because you just watch the two of them in that scene. There's beautiful pauses in there. There's distance between them that closes. There's this matter of factness about it. I would say being able to watch those two actors perform that scene that day was literally like watching a master class. Nobody overacted, nobody, did anything. There was this beautiful distance, and that scene is more about what wasn't said
Yeah.
than what was actually said. And to me, that was absolutely beautiful.
The other aspect is because Jeff is such a collaborator, when you have all this actor firepower, all these movie stars in all caps, everybody went there and they did their best work. Nobody was trying to one up anybody. Oh, I ride better. I act better. I'm better. It's like everybody was on the same wavelength. And that's hard to capture sometimes because things can pull people out, whether, you know, things that may happen on a bigger budget film. Oh, my trailer wasn't big enough, or some of the other ancillary things that may happen on a bigger picture. My time is wasted. I was in my trailer all night and I never got brought to set. But on a smaller picture with a guy like Jeff, there were no other distractions. Everybody just went there and they did the work, which I really, really, like Don said, it was like a master class. So who are we going to? Oh, we have this scene today with Tom Hardy and Jodie. It's just, it was like a menagerie of acting prowess, you know? So that was really cool.
I think it's all on the screen. I mean, we talk about a lot of the work behind the scenes, but again, it's a picture I think really came together well. I enjoyed it, even on a second viewing. And listeners, if you have managed to sit through this podcast and not check it out, well, go see the movie. It's actually really good. On that note, I think we'll call it a wrap. Great having you guys here.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Skid. And I'll maybe jump on again. I know you've been chasing me down for a while.
Yeah, we've been talking about it to get you on the show for a while, Pete. Don, you're welcome back anytime as well.
In my mind, no one wants to hear me ramble for 40 minutes, but maybe.
All right. Well, I think you got a story or two people might enjoy. Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info at our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. You'll also find past episodes and links to all of our social media. Please check it out. So where are we next going to see your guys' work? Together or separate? What have you been working on?
10/10/25, Tron Ares comes out, starring Jared Leto. We filmed that up in Vancouver over the past 2 years. And then Pete and I did a project last summer that's supposed to come out July 4th. I don't know if because of the fires in LA, it was actually shot in LA, whether or not the release date's going to be pushed, but it's a very interesting project. Pete, do you want to talk about that one?
It's a musical collaboration with the South Park creators, Matt and Trey, and Kendrick Lamar. So coming to a multiplex, supposedly July 4th, like Don said.
Yeah, so we're waiting to see again, perhaps with the fires that happened in LA, because we did the majority of the filming in LA County. Maybe it got pushed a little bit, but I'm hoping that they still are able to make that release date.
All right, well, I will put a pin down for both of those because, yes, the invite stands. You guys are welcome to come back and talk about it.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and all of our listeners, I appreciate you. The Below the Line logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. As I mentioned last episode, if you send me a picture of yourself in a Below the Line t-shirt, I'll thank you by name on the show. Other ways you can help the show: first, give us a positive rating wherever you get your podcasts. Second, share a positive review with your friends, because that's how new listeners find the show. All of that aside, whatever your engagement, the fact that you're still listening means a lot to me. Thanks again for Below the Line.